Hi, welcome to Closing the Loop. My name is Himanshu Arthi and I'm part of Ananas. Today we're going to be talking to Rico again. We're going to be talking about economics and ecological self-reliance. We're going to be expounding a little bit on the structure of the existing economic system, what is wrong with it, and we as conscious consumers and permaculture practitioners, what can we do about it? So yeah, let's hear what he says.
Hi, Rico.
Hey.
So, yeah, when we last spoke, we touched upon regenerative economics, and we felt that this was a good topic to explore in some more depth. And many people can't imagine anything other than the dominant economic paradigm that we're all a part of in the financial system as it is. And but there are actually many examples of people practicing healthier ways of like working together, exchanging goods and services. And we felt it would be nice to highlight some of those and also just explore a bit why it's necessary for us to find alternative approaches. So just to start us off, what would you say is wrong with the dominant economic system, and why do we need something new?
Yeah, that's a pretty complex question, and definitely there's a variety of responses, quite a few, and easily we could take up all the time and more that we have for this, but I'm going to note 4 of them, of what I would consider dominant. And the first sort of foundational one is more of the story we are told about the economic system, which is simply put sort of the idea of Darwinism combined with capitalism. And by Darwin, I mean this story we're told about survival of the fittest, which he did talk about. So there's this whole, since we've been little and everything, is nature's all about survival of fittest. That's the way nature works. And then you couple that, and it has been coupled, with this idea of capitalism, the ideology of capitalism, right? That forms are the core or the foundation of our economic system, these two. And that ideology, I would sum as, it's not necessarily, about capital. There's things about capitalism, about profit motive and all that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the ideology or sort of a belief structure in it, which is basically that if everybody acts in their own self-interest, the greatest good for the greatest amount of people will occur. That's the basic ideology. And so when you couple that with survival of the fittest, you get this whole sort of story or the foundation on which how to behave economically. Everyone's out for their own self-interest, and the strongest survive. So that, and the problem with that, and why that is a problem, is that it's not the truth, in the sense that Darwin did say survival of the fittest, but when he wrote about that, which I believe was the book of The Descent of Man, I believe it was in that book, it might have others, but that's whichever book it was that he put out that survival of the fittest. He mentioned that phrase 3, maybe 4 times in the book. In that same book, he used the word love 96 times. And while survival of the fittest is part of the story of the way nature works, it's more of a regulatory vessel, as it were, which we won't get into that whole idea. But nature, truly, if you look at the relationships in nature and the way nature flourishes, it's vastly based upon collaboration. The vast majority of relationships in nature are collaborative. And those ones that aren't particularly like mutually beneficial, there's one where maybe one benefits and the other one's indifferent. So, this whole, so it's a story, and it's a warp of the story. So that's the first problem, if you would, or challenge of it, is the foundations of Darwinism with this ideology of selfish behavior. The second problem is that we have an economy based in debt. Our economy is a debt economy, that from the monetary system to the whole way money is created, not just cash, but also mortgages, loans, credit cards, they're all based upon debt. And so that is a problem. because it basically creates debt slavery. And it basically disconnects our monetary system, our economic system, excuse me. It disconnects our monetary system. See, that's the problem. Money gets confused with the economy, which are different things. Money is a subset, which I'm about to get into, of the economy. But anyway, that the second is based that it's a debt economy. And the problem with this, well, I'll give an example of the challenge of debt economy and what it does, is that Canada in the mid 30s to the 73, their currency system was interest-free. And when we talk about debt, this debt is manifested through generally a compound interest. You know, it's not that you just owe someone, but you owe interest on your debt. So that's part of the crux. You know, debt itself is not necessarily a bad thing within its certain limits. It's the interest or the cost of debt, which we do as compound interest. Now, the example of Canada was that from mid 30s to 72, their currency system was interest-free. And ours are all based on that and compound interest on that debt. Where for them, they were able to finance a war, to finance social infrastructure, social programs, build all this infrastructure with interest-free currency. And their national debt at the time in 72 when it ended was about $37 billion. Now, in 72, they went off that and they went to regular interest. And in the next 18 years, their debt went from 37 billion to 400 billion within that time frame, within 18 years. Where in the past, they'd only accumulated over the previous 30 years or so, more than 30 years, like a little less than 40 years, they had only accumulated 37. And the government auditor of Canada, when they looked at this, they found that 85% of that debt was due to compound interest, not the debt itself, but the interest on the debt. So and now currently on average, the cost of everything is about 35% more because of the compound interest based on our debt economy. So we're paying over a third more for all our items due to compound interest. And the thing to understand that as an example, in Germany, some figure, I don't remember where this came from, I apologize, I wish I had the reference. But in Germany, they figure that 80% of the bottom 80% of the population is transferring over 600 million euro per day to the top 10% of the population. And this is through debt and compound interest on the debt. So basically the debt-based economy with compound interest as part of that debt is basically doing a transference it's basically impoverishing people. It's a debt slavery is the term that's often used. So that's the second challenge of the current economic system, is this debt-based compound interest aspect of it. The third one I'll be more quick on is that it's an economy of growth, that our economy is healthy when it grows, that each year production and consumption has to be higher than the year previous to it. And that's creating all these challenges, this growth mentality. And, if growth goes below 2%, they talk about, recession or stagnation, and it's unhealthy. And there's all these supposed problems that come out of it. So that's the third thing, is that it's a growth-based economy. The economy it's designed to grow. And we can't do that on our planet. That's just the reality of it. And then the fourth one, and this is pretty interesting for me. The fourth one is that basically that the economy is subverting our governments, the ability of governments as a representation of the populace. National governments in democracies, and the vast majority of the world is some type of democratic system. There's different types of democracies. The vast majority is supposedly now on paper and in language, democracies of some type or other. And that what has happened is that economic systems, economic institutions have subverted the governments. Basically, the idea and part of the story we're told is that governments manage the economy. You know, you get into this free market and other things like that, but whatever it is, I do believe that part of the job of the government is to manage our economies. And part of the understanding is that economies is not a monetary system, is a tool within the economic system. And I should have started with this. The term economy comes from Greek oikos for home and nomos for what many people, and I prefer to go with this, refer to as management. So economy is the management of the home. That's where economics is. That's what it is at its heart, at its basis, where it came from, is how are the systems we use to manage our resources, the system we use to manage our home, which is the earth, our physical world. So our governments, to me, that's a valid job of our governments as representations of their populace, is to manage the commons of that populace. Right, and if we have democracies and democracies are managing economies, therefore the economies then become democratic, or they have that democratic influence. However, what's happened is that the reverse is going on now, that the economies are managing the governments. And the economies, as I said in the first place, the story we're told is selfish people acting on survival of the fittest, and selfish people, selfish arrangements, selfish organizations, that the most powerful, the most successful, selfish entities through survival of the fittest achieve the most power and success, and they then become the drivers of the economy, and the economy has now subverted the governments. And if you don't believe that, consider our current situation. We are now coming out of COVID lockdowns. You know, that's been the talk for the last month, prior to the last month. And what's the number one reason we have to come out of lockdowns? Why do we have to leave lockdowns? Because of the economy, right? In the US, that's like Trump's big thing. It's like, and you have people in the economy say, well, if a few of the old folks die off, they're willing to do, this, I've heard politicians and people say, well, if the old folks have to die off, they'll gladly do that because the economy is important. What is that? That's just so blatantly subverting governments and people to the economy. The economy is more important than people, because if the old folks have to die so the economy is healthy, that's a small price to pay. So that's, to me, one of the outcomes of this other stuff is this whole idea that the economy is the most important thing, and it's not. What is important is our physical environment. That I agree with. I agree that managing our resources are important. However, that does not necessarily subvert or be in contradiction or conflict with human health, human happiness, and all that. It doesn't have to be. In fact, the two should go quite well together. That as we improve our economy, which basically means improving our, the way we're managing our resources, improves the health of our resources, improves the, brings, abundance to our resources, that will concurrently bring, health and prosperity to humanity, and so to me, so trying to keep this concise, that's the fourth, that the economy has subverted governments.
Right. It's very interesting that you mentioned that ecos and nomos is like home management, and it's management of resources. And you also mentioned that money is the subset of economy, and fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, it gets a bad rep. Is money actually bad? Like, how does one change the perception of this subset of economy?
So money itself is not bad. Money is a tool. The question is the form money takes. We've had different types of forms, this debt-based money being backed by debt and linked to compound interest and all that, is more of a recent, it's happened in the past a little bit, but in terms of human history, it's more of a recent development. We've had other forms that we could call money, and prior to this in the United States, and I think many parts of the world, the money was backed by gold or silver or some other item. So it's not that money is bad. It's the form or this type of money that creates these challenges. You know, so so that to me is what's important. So what's important is and then the second thing is to understand your relationship to into money. So much today, and I know I've struggled with this a little bit, obviously not a lot, but so many of us have been taught directly or even subversively, just through so many subtle ways, that your value is a direct proportion or relationship to your earnings. That the more you earn, the more successful you are at being a human. You know, if you earn a lot of money, then you're a good person. You somehow have succeeded. You know, so this linking of human value, the value of humans to their earning, which gets into also this idea of consumption, which is part of our economy, is we're taught to be consumers, because that's, you know, one of the challenges of our economy is based on production and consumption, you know, about growth. So that's to me, it's both that the form our money is in, which is, you know, compound interest-based debt. And the second is that it's been linked so much into human happiness. Therefore, we have to, you know, chase after the money, you know, and that we equate fulfilling our needs, wants, our desires through money with achieving happiness and status. You know, more money we have, the more status we have. So there's so that's, to me, it's that stuff. And we have to realign our understanding of what money is and realign our relationship to it. First off, whatever type the money is, be it debt-based or be it resource-based, whatever's backing the money, or the money is formed, you know, is the form of the money, with the currency. You know, independent of that, and I think the first step, because it's not like we can change the money overnight. So the most powerful thing we can do now is change our relationship to the money and disconnect our happiness, disconnect and reduce the amount we place value on ourselves and we place value on others, as money being the gauge of that, being the determinant of that.
So speaking of our relationship to money, it seems like basically practically everyone is locked into this kind of employer-employee relationship, where your only access to money is to initially sort of become an employee and then become an employer, and then you're sort of moving up this ladder. So is there something wrong with that sort of dynamic inherently? And like, can you just talk a little bit about, you know, wage labor and that whole, how we relate to each other in that way and that relationship with money?
Okay. Wage labor, you could see probably as a form of employer-employee relationship, but the word employer-employee sort of implies something like wage anyway. And within that structure, there's this hierarchy, in the sense that there's the boss and there's the employees, or the manager and employees, you know, the owner, the employees, whatever. And it's a challenging one, because when we talk about this, I'm not against aspects of what might be included in the capitalistic system, such as profit. Like people say, oh, you're anti-capitalism, then you're therefore anti-profit and all this. Being a permaculture person, we're all about profit, which we call yield or harvest or benefits or all these other terms. You know, there's all different, these forms that comes in. And so this idea of working relationship sort of falls in there. It's not, you know, there will be inherently hierarchies or people who are managing or directing or facilitating, you know, which might create some type of hierarchy. So it's a very subtle thing. I think if we're looking at it more of critique or getting into some judgment or value, you know, of better or worse or beneficial or not beneficial, you have to look, I guess, at both sort of equity and the potential of each person to express themselves and be contributing in a very productive way that's satisfying for them. You know, there's nothing wrong with being an employee as long as the conditions in which you're working have some aspects of control, in the sense that you have some influence on the work you're doing, you know, in terms of consulting, being consulted, like, okay, you're the guy who makes this thing, what do you think is a good way to do it? You know, or you're the one, you know, that's working in this factory. Are there conditions, what do you need to be happy and safe here doing this? You know, so even though there might be an employer-employee relationship, the employee themselves have some say in it. They have some influence on it. and they have some way in which they can buy into or feel connected to what they're doing. Not just a monetary paycheck, but there's some emotional benefit. There's some sense of accomplishment. There's some sense of contribution that means something. So to me, it's again more about the experience of the people. And same thing with the manager, because managers, and I've been in managerial positions before in terms of kitchens and other places, where you have sort of a boss on one side, employees on the other, and a lot of times you're stuck in the middle. Boss telling you one thing that you don't necessarily agree with, and you having to sort of interact with the employees in a way that you don't particularly like. So it works on all levels, and the employer, and again, if the employer is especially putting out money and taking a lot of the risks that the employees might not be taking, financial or otherwise, then, what do they need? They have some validity and some say in it. So it's more about that. And there's a lot of cooperatives that have this sort of employer-employee set, but they go into more of a collaborative level to it, where the manager has certain jobs, but a lot of decisions are made collectively. And a lot of the sort of what's happening is more of a collective thing, and that the manager sort of fulfills that role. And what a lot of this goes into and is expressed through is also pay discrepancies. That's one, again, this thing that's coming out of the economy, where in most co-ops, and in fact, just like 100 years ago, it would be where the lowest paid worker, the highest paid worker only earned something like 10 times or even less, 8 times the amount of the lowest paid worker. Now you have corporations where that difference is like 400 times more, than the lowest paid worker to the CEO. And sometimes can even get ridiculously higher, just something like Bezos or something like that, which is probably around 4,000 or something difference. So it's that sort of thing, it's that it's not so much the employer-employee in itself, it's more the conditions around which those things exist. And to me, it comes down to the ability of each person, whatever position they're in, that they have a concurrent level of input and influence on the experience of their work. So, and that the work that they can then have is one fulfilling to them, and not just monetarily, but emotionally, and in some ways, satisfaction in terms of contributing and all that.
Yeah.
And there's different ways that can happen.
Yeah. I think one thing that you were also mentioning is that, you were talking about Darwinism and the survival of the fittest. And I think these positions of like a boss, of a management and employees and all of that, if you add the survival of fittest aspect to it, and if you add greed to it, there's a certain level of inequality that comes up. So, yeah. and which we feel also is like which is where the problem is, right? When there is that gap, like for example, this Bezos is making so much more money. Like you mentioned about Germany, how 60% pays for that 10%. So how do we avoid falling into that trap as let's say as a permaculture practice or any small business? How do we avoid falling into that trap and perpetuating that inequality?
Well, it gets into how you design your business, basically. I know you guys in Ananas are, you're a growing business, pretty exciting to see, you're expanding and doing that. So it's about the systems you design into place. As you're bringing in new people, how do you integrate them into it so they can see the big picture, so they can understand the common goals, so they can buy into the common goals, so they understand how can they contribute, not just like there's pathways for them to contribute. They understand if they have an idea, how do they present it? Do they feel heard? It would be a lot on you guys as the principals or the ones who are doing this to create those, to create those pathways, and to also have them understand the limitations, sort of the challenges you're facing, so they can have some sympathy for you. So they're not just like, those guys, they're bosses and they have all this advantage and, they're not listening to me. It's that transparency. I guess that's what I'm getting at. Transparency all the way around, so that the people coming in, they can understand the challenges you guys are facing, and what you're giving or allowing, you know, in creating this, the vision, but also the challenges in creating this more collaborative or the input way, because it's a lot more work. You know, as a boss, it's a lot easier just to say, shut up and do what I tell you. You know, that's easy. What's hard is to take the feedback, to listen to them, to consider what they say. And if it's valid, then, okay, how do we work it into something we've already discussed and feel like, and here's this great idea, so how do we integrate it? That's a lot more work. So in terms of permaculture, it's sort of as much as possible, you have to, didn't quite get that. You have to design from the top down, you know, and then allow input from bottom up or in different directions, you know, and always be reflective and always be open, you know, yeah, take feedback. From the other direction, as permaculturalists, let's say we get hired into a place or we join a business in whatever form that is. One is you do your observation, you know, like, how does this work? What's going on? What's the power structures? How open are they? And then as much as possible, try to introduce these ideas, you know, look at the places in which you contribute, see, you know, and be transparent to some degree about it, you know. So there's things, if we're not, you know, if you're not an owner or you're not starting your own business, but you're coming into a business, then I definitely encourage people to be graceful, to be skillful, and to definitely practice observation, and just don't come in like, hey, we got to do this, we got to do that, you got to do this, you know, hierarchy, you know, and just friction. You know, it's like, if you want to really cause change, then be willing to bend, like, you know, like be all that Zen stuff, you know, as opposed to just like, you know, so, you know, when you come in on a lower rung, there's still possibilities there, you know, and I encourage people to follow those with skill and grace. With clients, and as permaculturalists, when we come into a project, let's say we're hired by a client, that's a whole nother thing then. And as you guys know, one of the things I really encourage when I'm, you know, in courses and stuff is that the client is not hiring you to do what they tell you, regardless of what they're thinking. You know, they're hiring you to be smart. And that I encourage everybody to go in and to sort of cultivate their relationship with the client as a collaboration. The client is hiring you, they are funding it, and that has to be respected. At the same time, it's really important to me that the whole process be collaborative, and that if the client could do this themselves, they wouldn't hire you, that you're bringing in very necessary skills. So in that sense, when you go in and bringing this sort of equitable relationship to a project, it's about building collaborations, you know, and recognizing the validity of the funder, the validity of whoever's in whatever position, at the same time, you know, fostering a atmosphere of collaboration and of equanimity. So those are sort of in the sense coming in a lower rung or coming in as a consultant or a project on a project level in terms of relationships with your co-workers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just looking a little bit into other ways that we can, as individuals and as members of human society, can start shifting things into creating more equitable relationships. Like from a personal level, you know, you've also shared with us some points about, from a personal level to a social level, the different things that we can do. So one of the things that you talk about is, the first point is about consuming less. Do you want to just talk a little bit about, like, I mean, that's something that, like, we say, and we sort of, you know, we all say, oh yeah, we should consume less. Do you have any thoughts on how we can actually really practice that, and how you can get started doing that?
Yeah, this is sort of going into what to do. You know, there's all this talk about economics, all this talk about We have to change things, you know, and what to do. And there's the big things and there's the small things and there's the small things that achieve big things. And consume less is one of those small things. Basically, it's something you can do, and it's pretty straightforward. It's just simply consume less. You know, how more simpler can you get than that? 2 words, right? But it's going to have such huge outcomes if you really follow it. And that's something that doesn't require changing the full economy. You know, you don't have to go out there and create a whole economic system and globally, you know, shift. It's something each individual can do. Yet it has profound, not just effects upon you, but also profound social, you know, if so many people did this, it would create so much change if people just did this. So when we say consume less, I mean, that's basically it. And when you think about consume less, it's basically, you got to ask, you know, basically you do an assessment, you know, what are you consuming? You know, like assess how much are you consuming, right? Where does it come from? What is it made of? You know, where are the materials? How are they mined? How is it manufactured? What are the costs? You know, sort of assess the things you're consuming. It's not just about consuming less, but it's about what you're consuming, right? And this gets into then a little bit about waste stream. So they're all sort of, all 3 linked in that sense. You know, I guess you could say consume less, know what you consume, and waste less. You know, like reduce your waste stream. Yeah, and that's just, and that is, yeah, that's just so powerful to do. You know, and it gets into what is a want and what is a need. You know, if you're consuming something, why are you consuming it? Like, why, you know, why are you consuming that? Is it a need? Because a lot of times people say, oh, I need the new iPhone. It's like, no, you don't really need it. You know, you want it, granted. You want it. I can see that. But you don't really need it. All right, so understanding why do you want this? You know, why are you consuming this, I should say. And then if it is something you want, like it's like, okay, my phone broke. I need a new phone. Or I want a new phone. You know, in this world, often it's a need, you know, in terms of just communication, work, and other things. In terms of that, it's right on that boundary between a need and a want. So it becomes sort of what I've made this commitment. I mean, there's one new phone I may buy if I can afford it, which is the Fair phone, which we won't, some of you may know about that. I'm not going to talk about it. But other than that, I've made my vow I'm never going to buy a new phone again. In fact, my last phone was, you know, design obsolescence. It was starting to fall apart, you know, have problems. So I went to a phone market in Bangalore and so hunted around, bought a used phone, right? And from now on, that's what I'll do. And my old phone I still have because it can get repaired. So next time in India, I'm going to get it repaired. So it's just not about consuming less. It's if you are going to consume, then be aware of what it is. And see if you can get something simpler, something less impactful to fulfill that, you know. If you need a new car, well, maybe you don't need, like in the United States, an SUV or this big thing. Maybe a tiny thing will do just as well for you, you know. Things like that. And so, then know where it comes from, all the questions, you know, social impacts, distances traveled, materials used, because phones have all these rare earth materials in electronics. That's one of the big, huge challenges of electronics is all this rare earth. And often these come from conflict zones. So there's a lot of human suffering involved in the production of phones and electronics. So we know, you know, that's why transparency, we talk a lot about that. So you know, working conditions, fair pay, social issues and things like that. And then one of the good ways to consume less is to be aware of your waste stream. And that's one thing here where I live here. I have my little baggie and I'm watching it grow each week, you know, and I basically about each week I get about that much trash. That's about what I'm in a 1 week volume is about that much, you know, so that you're very aware of how much you're producing. And it's all plastic, basically, you know, separate out your organics, you know, get those to a friend or just if you're near some woods, just simply toss them out in the woods if you can. If you have no other place, no friend who wants a compost, or you don't buy your little worm bins, your daily dumps in Bangalore, those clay pots. Recycling is just starting there, and you have recycling, so try to find out that and see where you can separate your stuff out. Things like that. Try to really and watch your waste stream as a gauge for your consumption level. And in terms of buying stuff, look for things that are recyclable. Look for things that can be repurposed. Like, okay, no longer is it good for this thing, but now I can use it for something else. Or can it be upcycled, where you take a material that you change, use it in some other way so that its value increases. Like a lot of places in Asia, they'll use old plastic bags to make things out of. So these trash bags, these little pieces of plastic create something of value. So like that. So waste is a good gauge of consumption.
Right. You were talking about buying things also, like how consumption is always tagged with buying local. So, and like that's one way to build the local economy. But in this current system, like there's so many things that come from outside. How does one go about investing or just ensuring that they're more mindful of buying local?
Yeah, that's a challenge, of transparency and stuff, It depends what you're getting and how to do it. I mean, with food, it's pretty straightforward in India to go to the local markets, that not always, but you can generally find the farmers, or depending on the type of markets you go to. And in India, food can be sourced pretty locally, if, even organic food now, because there's a lot of these markets that are going organic. In terms of organic local markets in Bangalore, I know there's some like with they're more subscription based, but Navadarshanam and a few others that you can source local organic food through, and some local organic stores. So food is pretty kind of easy just to look around and shop. The other things get a bit harder. I mean, I was I was going to say some of the government-run bhavans, the Kadi bhavans. I think there's another term. I'm not quite getting it. But it's the local crafts, that the government runs. But I've been in there where I've seen little Hindu statues that I know, and the guy even confessed after I joked about and sort of poked him that they were from China. So that's the big, the government local craft sort of store. So you still have to be careful. In India, it's really a challenge because people will tell you what they think you want to hear. So it's just, you just got to do the research, and that's sort of the hard part. When in starting off on this path, if you're sort of new to it, and you go, okay, I want to do better. You've sort of decided, and you're making the steps, which is great. Thank you very much for those people who are taking the steps to live on our planet in a more healthy, regenerative way, that sometimes it's a little daunting. And the thing I have to say is, yes, in the beginning, it's a little harder because you have to do research, you have to find these places. However, be assured that as you go along this pathway, it gets easier, because when you figure out how to find things, you figure out the ways to go about finding things. And then as you find things, it's sort of like, oh, now I know these 3 or 4 sources for my food that I'm pretty sure are organic, or locally sourced. So that's now you've sort of solved that one. And so now as you're doing it, life, as you follow the path, it becomes easier. So don't get intimidated in the beginning. Yes, it's a bit of a challenge in the beginning. However, as you do it, it becomes easier.
I think,
yeah.
Like a lot of times, I think we talked about it in the last podcast as well, about communities. And a lot of thing that I personally hear is that, okay, I'm going to consume less, I'm going to buy local. But what if my neighbor, he's not buying local, he's not consuming less? It's like, how am I going to make a difference? A lot of people get lost in the idea of, if I'm the only one doing it, is the world going to change? That's like the larger narrative that we hear, which again, we talked about community last time, that we need to have communities, like smaller communities, that are doing more of this, so that you're more inspired and you can inspire other communities as well. So do you know of any, and consuming less is probably the first step in regenerative living.
Yeah.
Do you know of any good examples of communities that are doing these like practicing this kind of living with regenerative economies and degrowth and so on?
And just got that word in there finally, degrowth.
Yeah.
The first, you sort of asked two questions, and one I sort of wanted to respond to in the beginning, where you're saying like just the individual, I change my consumption habits, but my neighbor is still, consuming large amounts and this and that. And the thing is you can't change your neighbor. The only person you can change is yourself, and the only person that's going to change the neighbor is the neighbor themselves, right? And that the more you model and manifest the benefits, because we're going to get to, I imagine we're going to end up with this idea of a simple life is an abundant life, but how, as you follow along this pathway, if you truly are following it and really manifesting these things in your life, I'm pretty confident in saying that you're going to find satisfaction. You're going to find these points of happiness. You're going to find out that while life might not necessarily be easier, it'll be a lot more satisfying. And that there will be these out of that satisfaction, this sort of deeper happiness that comes from it. And in the sense that if you're just living your life, consuming less and following your pathway, that's the most influential thing you can do for your neighbor, right? You're not going to change him by complaining to him, by pointing things out, by being, holier than thou. You're just going to create a wall, right? If you just are friendly with your neighbor or have an open heart with your neighbor, and if they ask questions, be honest and transparent with your neighbor, but just live your life, change yourself, follow this pathway. And as you follow and manifest these things, the neighbor, especially if you have this growing relationship with your neighbor because you're open-hearted and you're just sort of, hey, how's it going? They'll change when they're ready. So that's my first thing is like, don't base your happiness, don't base your decisions on someone else. That's how you're unhappy. And that's how you get all messed up, right? Be aware of what you need to be happy yourself. Follow the path that your heart tells you to follow, right? That's it. Now, examples of this community, you're asking about, mentioned communities then, and then how are there, I can give examples of this. Yeah, especially I already mentioned was Narvadarshanam, right? Out there southeast of Bangalore. What's the town with an A? There's the town you can get on a city bus right next to the edge of Tamil Nadu. The town is just escaping my name. The name of it's escaping my brain. Anekal. So yeah, that's where you can take a city bus out to there, and then if you're in Narvadarshanam, their website is their name, which I'm not going to spell it, but it's pretty straightforward, in terms of the pronunciation of the name. That's in Hindi. You can get that pretty easily, straightforward. Narvadarshanam.org. And if you web search, you'll find it. You can write them. And they're doing a lot. They grow their food. They're Gandhian based. They've worked really well. They've done great things with the local communities, helping them set up businesses, that are cooperatives and, community-based businesses. So they're really great. That's really a good one. Bhumi College has now the communities you asked about. So
I remember during
please.
I just want to mention, you actually shared with us during our first course that we did with you about Deccan Development Society. And actually, I always go back to them, like in my mind, when I think of like something that's really, it seems to be incredibly effective as a model, where they shifted away from the public distribution system, which they realized wasn't helping them in any way from a health standpoint, and they also moved away from farming, and then they created their own community grain fund, and so I mean that's also, I definitely think people should check them out. They make their own videos on YouTube and put them up. That seems to encompass a lot of what we're talking about as well.
It is definitely as in terms of they're an NGO, so they're an organization as opposed to sort of a community like Narvadarshanam isn't, I'm sure they have an NGO status or something because they do work. I'm not sure of their legal status is. But Deccan is definitely, Deccan Development Study, DDS, is definitely someone to check out for project work, for successful programs, for community development. As you say, the Community Grain Fund is an amazing thing. So all that, definitely.
I think even Buffalo Back that Vishala runs is also something which is, which kind of covers all of this. They keep the bit of a regional economy.
Buffalo Back?
Yeah, it's called
I'm
Buffalo
not familiar with that one. Yeah.
Oh, it's again
Buffalo
another
Bag?
CSA system. Yeah, Buffalo Back.
Oh, okay.
It's called Buffalo Back.
Oh, Pack.
It's a pretty cool system again. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's also, up towards, as you know, up near, just inside of, now come on, not Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, just inside AP, coming north from Bangalore, by that big Kia. Yeah, Anantapur district, but right near the big Kia factory now is Timbuktu. I'm talking about organizations that are doing a lot of amazing work. And of course, transparency, here I am doing work with them. I'm very, fond of them, and they have a project, Kailas on Farm, which you've been at, both of you have been out to. So that's another great organization, Timbuktu, just inside AP from Bangalore, going north. So you give a shout out to them and Duhita and Bablu and Mary.
This is coming a little bit away from the examples of communities, but like one thing that all of these guys have in common is that they emphasize localization. And I know we just talked about buying local from one standpoint, but I just wanted to see if we could get into a little bit more why it's important to actually circulate money locally. Because I think oftentimes buying local is kind of looked at more from an energy perspective as well, of like, consuming less energy and not shipping and all of that stuff. But actually this point of like why actually we want money, and this is also where local currency and things come in, why is it important to circulate money locally?
Right. Yeah, there's actually a buddy of mine made this little video about the story I tell of and you all have heard it, about the backpacker coming into a village and spending 10 rupees or 5 rupees at a tea shop, and then that 5 rupees looping through 2 different communities. And that's Astral Jester film. So that's just another guy. He's a Brit guy, but he was a good friend of mine. We did a lot of work in Cambodia together. He filmed me. There's a few films through him recording my work, but he just did a little one on that, about local cycling of money within economy, village economy. Basically, the reason, so money, when it circulates, it's basically a medium of exchange, and that exchange creates relationships. It's all about relationships. So it's more, as you keep that value, the money that represents a value, that medium of exchange, as it stays within an economy, within a community, it then facilitates all these exchanges, okay? Now, physically, what it literally does is that it literally feeds people, right? Because, the more exchange there are on money, people like, oh, I've earned this money, So then they go to the local farmer and buy some food, or they go to the local, dairy and get some milk, So it literally facilitates in feeding the people. It allows for more successful businesses, right? As the money circulates through the business, if that rupee, because it cycles and stays in that community, it might go through a business 4 or 5 or 10 times. And if it goes through the community 10 times, then that 1 rupee represents 10 rupees to that business, right? So it's increased the income of that community 10 times. So it, basically builds successful community businesses. So businesses grow. It supports a wider diversity, because not just businesses, but trades, if it circulates, if you have all this money circulating, now you can have, support the local plumber, support the local blacksmith, support the local, craftsperson, right? So all this money cycling creates a diversity of trades and crafts and skills and services. It also allows for the production of goods, right? So now you can have local factories or people who are producing things. Not just the, craftsperson, which might be a craft material, but maybe it might be even a local production facility of some type. So you get all of this builds community, right? All this sort of interchange and facilitating businesses and crafts and this and manufacturing. Then socially, so that's all the physical stuff. This then socially, it allows person-to-person relationships, right? So instead of me going to some store and buying this thing, I can actually potentially know the person who made it, right? I know the farmer who grew my food, right? I know my tradespeople, right? So this local economy facilitates person-to-person interaction. So it builds social communities, it creates relationships between people. And this, and then the third thing is that transparency becomes easier, right? We talk a lot about transparency. Now, like I said, consume less and what you consume, what were the social conditions, what it's made of, are there any issues involved? What about environmental impacts? If you know the farmer, you can see that. If you know, oh, this was produced in this factory, like the local production place, you can see the work conditions. You know people who work there, right? You can ask your buddy who works there, or you can ask your buddy's brother's wife who works there, So this transparency becomes hugely a lot more expansive, for you to know what you're consuming. Right. And so there's a couple more things.
Yeah, sure.
Because this gets to a really critical point, because I think people need to understand. So we said consume less. That's like number one. Number two is consume locally. These two together are like so huge in changing the situation we're in now and dealing with a lot of this stuff. So that's why it's important we really lock this in for people to see how critical this is. Because the third thing I was going to say is that likely there's a higher probability of whatever you consume will be more culturally, environmentally appropriate, right? Because things are more adapted to local culture. If you buy from a local nursery, you're getting your plants and supplies that you're going to put into the ground, your trees, your seeds from the local people, then it's going to be adapted locally. If you're getting the craft materials or the materials locally, then it's going to be more appropriate to the culture of the local community, right? So localness helps not just support, it builds culture because you're interacting with the culture, the money and the resources and energy is cycling through the communities, but it's also more appropriate, it builds culture through appropriateness and environmentally appropriate. So this gets to the outcome, sort of all this stuff. What does this lead to? It leads to prosperity. And this is what I want to reclaim that word, because last time at the end of it, or one point in the last interview we talked about mineral springs. And this is where I really sort of got that big aha moment. One point I was at Mineral Springs, I think, the 7th year I was there or something. I'm a little slow, but I was sitting there and all of a sudden I had this big sort of like, oh my goodness, these people are prosperous. And prosperity does not mean wealth. A lot of people think, oh, I'm wealthy, therefore I'm prosperous. No, prosperity is about quality of life. It's about having a high quality of life and a full life. And that does not equate to money. And in this Mineral Springs place, they don't necessarily earn a lot of money, but they have, I was saying, this huge forest garden, plus this very integrated community, this very cohesive community where they help each other out, and they're really, really strong community. So the income they get, a lot of it is disposable in that they don't have to spend it for food so much. They don't need their water. Their homes, they build themselves out of local, mostly. They're doing cement now because that's sort of the, thing. But that this is a very prosperous community. And this prosperity is directly based into the agricultural system, into their environment, into their economy, their local economy of resources, how they're managing their local resources, right? So the whole idea of building local economy is about, that's what leads to prosperity, right? Having a strong local economy, having good businesses there, cycling your resources, transparency, building culture. and disconnecting your happiness to your income, right? Your happiness is based on your relationship to your environment and based upon your relationship to your neighbors, right? And building local economy builds prosperity. And so you can say basically these things lead to a higher quality of life and a higher happiness quotient. Okay. Now you were going to say much.
Yeah. A lot of it is that we talked about is also from the personal level, and permaculture is also about starting from personal, then going to local, and then the regional level. So how much of this personal level can we do, and how do we move the governments, because the governments also have to come down to this level to understand that this is what we need, right? And as permaculturists and as people who are designing these things and are living this kind of life, how do we influence the larger system? Should we get into policy, and how do we influence the larger system is the question.
Well, I encourage everybody to exert as much influence as they can, again, in a skillful, graceful way. The more skillful and graceful you do it, I think the more effective you will be. And at the same time, I must say, as you're seeing here in the United States with Black Lives Matter, sometimes you just have to stand up and say enough is enough, you know, like fuck it. So, you know, sometimes you just have to stand up and say enough. So I don't want to discount that. At times that's needed. However, yes, start locally. And if you're going to advocate for change, you better be manifesting the change yourself. Again, I sort of briefly mentioned last talk about the Gandhian story about the young child and sugar, and, you know, him having to stop sugar before he told the child not to eat sugar. And that's basically one reason you start, you know, yourself, if you want to work locally in terms of affecting change, and especially as you go higher into the power structures trying to affect change, and you better well be doing it yourself. And the part of the reason is that the stronger the base you build, the more effective you can be as you go higher up in the level of governments, right? Because if you're just one individual, they'll, depending who you are, you know, and again, if you have a lot of money, they're going to listen to you more than if you don't. But the more base you have, then the more serious they're going to take you. And the higher you go, the harder it gets in terms of a person or something affecting change. That shouldn't stop you. You know, I forget if it was Margaret Mead or there's a famous person, but, you know, have no doubt that a small group of people can cause large change, because that's how it's, you know, something about how that's always how it's happened or something. It's again one of those, it all depends in terms of how you do it. It all depends in terms of the situation, because politics, it has a lot, just like humans, there's a lot of commonality between humans and a lot of this, you know, cross humans. At the same time, there are specifics for each place, and politics is just like that. You know, why there's a commonality between Indian politics and American politics, there's also very unique situations in each of those. So it's an all depends, it's sort of all depends thing. And we need to be working on all levels at the same time. So the only thing in terms of a response to your question is, for those who are pulled to work on a higher level, I totally support you doing that. In doing that, build your base, change yourself, work with this, understand, because that's where you learn your lessons, right? Start small and simple, because then the mistakes you make and the learning you have is much, you know, much more manageable level. Don't make mistakes on the governmental level, because then you could lose all credibility, and that's it, it's over. So start small and then work your way up. And for those of you who want to work on that high level, bless you. And be aware that, as they said here, you know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So be aware as you move up through the system, that the system has mechanisms within it to corrupt you in a way to, because every organism works for its own survival. And political organisms are no different from biological organisms in this way. So as you try to change political systems, that system is going to resist as a survival mechanism. And part of that is that there's these very subtle and different ways in terms of compromises, in terms of these other ways. So as you work up onto that level, again, that's where the skillfulness and the self-observation come in. So we need to work on all levels. And I totally support and bless those who work on the higher level, start at the base and work up.
So we've mentioned a couple of times these 12 points that you shared with us of how we can build local economies and create this change. And we've talked about consuming less. And we'll also link to, we'll write all those points down for viewers so they can read through it. We'll put that in the description. But the last, it'd be nice to talk about the last point that you made, which is about reframing your mind. And if you just wanted to talk about that a bit. Like how we can...
Right, first I want to clarify basically what this list is. And it's local economy is on it. I've titled this list more of what to do. And local economies are one of the things in terms of creating and building local economy. And basically what to do is about how to deal with our current situation and how to prepare for what is to come. Right, because we haven't gotten into it yet, but there's a lot of talk and a lot of this stuff we've been going around about economy, about this situation gets into potential for collapse. And are we heading towards a collapse, or what sort of challenges are we facing? And we sort of got on that, talking about the pandemic last time, all these situations. That could easily be whole nother chat, maybe. This whole idea of, because so many people are talking about it, the potential, or maybe what is this collapse. So the 12 things. So yeah, definitely put that up there, because it's about what can we do currently, consume less, build local economy, downsize is one of them, which gets into that, like, instead of getting the big car, get the small car. One of the things I love on this list is be valuable. And sort of these questions we ask, what can people do? It's like develop a skill, become valuable. Like, how can you add value to whatever you do? If you want to become, like, if you want to do permaculture, how can you add value to the practice of permaculture? If a client hires you, how do you add value to that? So thinking about that's through skills, through knowledge, through other things. So this last one, and it's the last one because in some ways it's sort of the last is first sort of idea, in the sense that it's one of the most powerful things you can do. And this last one is reframe your mind. And we sort of already gotten into that a little bit around, just talking about that is like, what is money? And understanding what money is, and change your relationship to money, because money is not inherently in itself a bad thing. We've been using it, it's sort of, we created it. It's a creation of human mind because it had a function. It's a tool. It's more about our relationship to it, the form it takes and how we relate to it. So a lot of these things we can start working with starts from how we frame it, how we understand it, and how we choose to relate to it. And that's hugely powerful. Now, there is a physical reality out here that exists independent of us. That's my personal belief. We are embedded in it and we are interacting with it. And at the same time, it exists outside of us. I do believe that. And while I agree with you create your own reality, it's not as if we create this reality. It's just that, and I'm not going to go into that, how do we create a reality, but it's that we have influence on it. And a lot of this influence is the way in which we choose to frame it. And that frame, and this is a nice loop. We started out with the first question about the story. I mentioned that the economy is a story. And as humans, we tell stories to give meaning to our lives. There's a whole, many people who talk about this idea of humans creating stories to give meaning and to understand our reality. And when you reframe your mind, you change the story. And that's hugely powerful on yourself. And in changing that, your story to reality, you change how you interact with it. And that, as we said, that's the only thing you can change is yourself. You can't change your neighbor. So an example of these things is we're talking about is reframing your understanding of money. What is money? And while I think it's imperative for us eventually, and we'll have to change our monetary system because this whole debt-based economy, growth economy, compound interest is not going to work. It's debt slave. It's just, it's oppression. So while that's going to be a huge amount of work to change that, it's not like we can reframe it and all of a sudden we're not part of it. It's that exterior reality where I have to use money. I can't get away from it. Hard, unless, and I'm about as close, I mean, people are closer than me, but I'm pretty much on the edge of the money economy out here, you know, but I'm still embedded in it. However, you can reframe your understanding of that money and how you relate to that money. One is reduce debt and don't be in debt. You know, clear all debts as you can and really be aware of that. The second is, and you hear me talk about this when I do my little economics talk, is that our democratic system, you know, especially when you go higher up into the, you know, depending on, you know, if you're in California or if you're in some big state in India, like Maharashtra or something, you know, it gets this big machine. And when definitely we get them to national, it's like, it's hard to have any influence on that level. What it's a sort of slip, but so voting, that's what I was getting into. The way you vote now is with your money, and understand money as voting, and how you spend your money is your vote. And if you go to, you know, in the United States, if I went to Walmart or some of these other big, you know, Amazon, you go on Amazon, then I'm voting for that system. Whereas if I go to my local farmer, I go to my local store, my local craftsperson, then I'm voting for that system. So then reframing your mind, reframe your understanding of money, and understand money as voting. You know, this idea of the simple life is the abundant life. We didn't get into that, but that's this whole idea of like understanding that if you want abundance and prosperity, live a simple life. I mean, it's so, I can't describe it. As you reduce your needs, your wants truly, because certain needs you have to have: water, food, adequate shelter, human companionship, right? Those are important. Those are needs. But do you need the latest iPhone? Do you need 2,000 meters of home space? You know? No, you want it. And when we won't go into it, but when you simplify your life, abundance becomes so much easier and so much readily available. And that's where prosperity becomes so much more accessible. When you have this huge, like 2,000 meter this, you know, 2 cars, this stuff, it gets really hard to satisfy that. So reframing your mind to understand that the simple life is the abundant life, and that abundance is another word for prosperity. And prosperity, happiness is a direct outcome of prosperity. You know, so a simple life is a happy life. That's reframing your mind. You know, so that's just, I think that is so critical. And the last part of the reframing your mind is not so much about reframing your mind, but using your mind as a tool, you know, and it's a tool that needs to be sharpened. And one of the things that I've said, which is true and not true, is like, I don't care what you think. I just want you to think. Right. And that's basically true. That's a first step. And it's kind of, you know, I do care about what you think, obviously, because I'm sitting here chatting to you, you know, you're preaching, as it were. But first and foremost, I want you to think. And so much of our education system, that's the 11th, that's the point before this, is to reorientate education. That's point number 11. And so much of our education is about becoming a cog in the machine, especially in the United States. And that's one thing. So many people want to emulate the United States. I'm like, don't do that. You see what's happening here? We have Trump. We have, you know, the riots with Black Lives Matter. We have all this racism. We have all this debt slavery. You know, we have colonization by the corporation. So it's like, be careful what you wish for. So the thing about reframing your mind, there's that. At the same time, as your mind is a critical tool to sharpen and be critical thinking. right? I'm sitting here, you know, preaching to you, you know, sort of espousing my views. What do you think? Do you agree with it, disagree? Why? This does it make logic? Does it not? You know, think critically. I think if we had at least, we need over 50% of the population thinking critically if we're going to be democratic about it, right? And I think we're far below that number at the moment. So it's reframing your mind and develop critical thinking. So there's not, you know, consume less, think more. How about that? Simple life is an abundant life. Consume less, think more. Thank you. Is that okay?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. This has just been so many ways. Amazing.
Awesome. So let's I'll look forward to seeing this new video, and then let's see maybe in next 23rd.
Yeah, we can do another one.
Yeah, another one.
Yeah. Cool. It's a series.
Yeah, it's a series.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. Awesome. All right.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you
so much,
Thank
Rico.
you so much. Good evening.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah, I hope I get to see you this year.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Soon.
Bye,
When I
Rico.
come, if I come, it's October, and if I'm able to come in October, it'll be Bangalore. So I'll see you guys.
Awesome.
Oh,
Great.
super.
Can't wait. We'll do one in person then. Okay. Bye.
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 Bye. Big hug.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
You haven't moved at all, Johnny. That's amazing. I'm impressed with how you have not moved. Totally. You're my inspiration for meditation, Johnny.